I come from South Texas. To be more exact, I'm from San Antonio, and I come from a primarily Hispanic family. As a child, I was cared for by my mother's parents. Whenever both of my parents were too busy to care for me or my siblings, and while they frowned upon scaring us with the old stories, my grandparents didn't see a problem with it. My grandparents knew many Hispanic myths, some of them silly, but most of them are deep-rooted in tradition and superstition. Most of these tales were built and adjusted to teach children to be well-behaved and to listen to their parents and obey their elders. In example, don't be naughty, or La Lechuza will come steal you and eat you. Beware of La Chupacabra. My siblings and I were told stories of the Donkey Lady Bridge, Midget Mansion, the haunted train tracks, and of course the Chinese graveyard. San Antonio is a place filled with lots of scary shit. Right now though, I'd like to share with you my experiences with one of our many famous myths, La Llorona, or the Wailing Woman. For those of you who haven't ever heard it, I will tell you La Llorona's story before I tell you what I experienced. While there are many versions of her tale, this is the one my grandmother always told throughout my childhood. La Llorona was once a beautiful young woman who lived in a very poor and rural village. She tended to the few livestock her father owned and was always obedient of her parents. One day, when she was nearing adulthood, a young man passed through her village with a hunting party and asked her father if they could stay the night on his small farm. When she saw the young man, she fell instantly madly in love with him, and apparently the young man shared her feelings because that same night he asked her to marry him, and so they were wed. The young man moved to the village and built a small home for him and the woman, and together they had the two most beautiful children anyone had ever seen. As time passed, the man spent more and more time away from their house and avoided the woman's questions as to where he kept going. So one morning, as he left, she decided to follow him. She followed him into the woods, and in a clearing there, she saw him being very personal with another woman, filled with a rage she had never known before she ran through the woods. The branches caught and tore her dress until nothing remained but the pure white slip she wore underneath. Arriving at her home, she found that her children had gone to play by the lake nearby. When she saw them all, she could see was her husband's face. Crying tears of rage, she held the children underwater until they drowned and left their bodies there. When she returned home, she found her husband there and told him what she had done. He told her that he would never love her again. Realizing the great evil she had committed, she ran to the lake to retrieve the bodies of her children, only to find that the current had pulled them away. Wailing and screaming, she walked into the water, and just before she drowned, she vowed that she would take any children that she found and would kill whoever tried to stop her. The legend goes that any child who is awake past their bedtime will be visited by La Llorona, and if someone tries to stop her from taking the child, that person will die. Now that you know her story, let me tell you mine. I was a troubled child, and making friends was always difficult. I was bad about wandering off, and I would always find an excuse to be awake after my bedtime. In short, I was the child that all of the stories were geared towards. It was one particular night that I had been especially bad to the point where I'd already been spanked twice. My mother sent me to bed early, and there were no goodnight kisses to be received, so I did what any other 10-year-old child would do. Knowing that no parents would be coming to check up on me, I got out of bed and began to play and make a mess. I knew it must be late out and that it was far beyond my bedtime. I couldn't be sure of the exact time, but I could hear my father snoring loudly, and that was enough for me to know how late it was. In fact, it was probably because of the snoring that I didn't hear her cries until it was too late for me to run to my bed and pretend to be sleeping. It started low, a noise I was sure that I must be imagining because of all the stories my grandmother told me. When it got louder and closer to my room, I knew it had to be real though. So I climbed into my bed as I heard scratching on my door, and a voice so sad and desperate I began to cry. In her wailing tones, she cried out, mis hijos, estás aquí? Or translated, my children, are you here? At this point, I was shaking my eyes, locked onto my bedroom door as she cried out again, saying this time, por favor, vuelve a mí. Mama es mucho, or please come back to me. Mama is so sorry. I was crying and screaming for my parents as my door slowly opened and she let out another mournful cry. Lo siento, mis bebés. Mama lo siente. Or I'm sorry, my babies. Mama is sorry. She pushed open the door, and there she was, in her pure white dress, her long black hair hanging over her face, pale hands covering her eyes. She slowly looked up. Her brown eyes were bloodshot. Her spirit had been crying for so long that now they were tears of blood. I let out an ear-piercing scream as she said, Usted ha sido malo. Es el momento de volver a casa. Or, you have been bad, it is time to come home. And that's the moment she came running at me, her arms reaching for me as I shoved my tiny body into a corner, screaming at the top of my lungs, and my father, a true 6'4" bear of a man, came barreling into my room, screaming at her, Ela deje la puta mierda solo, usted no robará otra persona que me encanta. Or leave her the fuck alone, bitch. You will not steal another person that I love. La Llorona turned to him, fury in her eyes with decaying finger pointed towards my father. She screamed, Usted va a morir por robar mis hijos, or you will die for stealing my children. My father collapsed, clutching his already bad heart, and as he convulsed on my bedroom floor, La Llorona slowly vanished while cackling and sobbing. By the time I woke, my mom and the ambulance had arrived. My dad had already passed. It has always broken my heart knowing that he gave his life to save mine. It wasn't until years later, when I was finishing my junior year of high school, that I found out what my dad meant by stealing someone else that he loved. My dad's mother was on her deathbed, and she was telling me the story of her life, including the hidden fact that my dad's brother didn't really die at the age of 6, he was actually stolen. My father insisted for most of his remaining childhood that La Llorona had stolen his brother. My grandmother never believed him, but now I knew the truth of my father's preparedness when the wailing woman stole into my bedroom. On this day, I am a 20-year-old woman. I have a job, I go to college, I live in a single flat apartment with my cat. In all regards, I am a well-rounded and sensible adult. But to this day, I am always in bed early, always asleep before midnight. Some nights, if I push it too far, I still hear her softly sobbing. She never gives up on finding her children. I had heard the stories about La Llorona ever since I was a little girl. My abuela used to tell me tales of the ghostly woman who roamed the streets at night, searching for her lost children. But I never believed them until now. It started when I was walking home from a friend's house. I decided to take a shortcut through the abandoned house at the end of the street. It was a creepy place with broken windows and overgrown weeds. As I walked past it, I heard a faint crying sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I got closer to the house, the crying became louder and more intense. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like she was in pain. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard a child's voice calling out for help. I ran into the house, my heart racing, but as I entered the dark and dusty rooms, I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. The crying led me deeper into the abandoned house. It was pitch black, and the only light came from the moon shining through the broken windows. I stumbled through the debris, calling out for whoever was crying. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slowly made my way up the stairs, my breaths becoming shallow. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her, La Llorona. She was standing in front of a broken mirror, crying and moaning. Her eyes were empty and lifeless, and her hair was long and tangled. I tried to run, but she caught me with her icy grip. I struggled to break free from her grip, but it was no use. La Llorona's strength was overwhelming. I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst to happen, but suddenly I heard a child's voice calling out to her. La Llorona turned her attention away from me, her grip loosening. In that moment, I managed to break free and ran out of the house as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was far away, panting and sweating. I knew I had narrowly escaped the legendary Weeping Woman. After my encounter with La Llorona, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I tried to push the memories aside and convince myself that it was just a bad dream. But then the nightmares began. Every night I would wake up in a cold sweat, with images of La Llorona haunting me. I could hear her crying, and I could feel her cold breath on my neck. I was afraid to sleep, afraid of what I might see in my dreams. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth about La Llorona. So I started doing research, digging through old books and articles. And that's when I found it, the truth about the legend. La Llorona was a woman who had drowned her children in a fit of rage and then killed herself. Her ghost now roamed the streets, searching for her lost children. I realized that I had come face to face with her and survived. As I delved deeper into my research, I found more disturbing details about La Llorona. Her story was more sinister than I had ever imagined. She was said to have been driven to madness by her husband's infidelity, and in a fit of rage, she drowned her children in the nearby river. The guilt and despair of her actions weighed heavily on her, and she took her own life soon after. But that was not the end of her story. Her ghostly form was said to roam the streets at night, wailing and crying, searching for her lost children. And those who were unfortunate enough to cross her path met a gruesome end. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened to me if La Llorona had caught me in her icy grip. As I continued my research, I came across an old diary of a woman who claimed to have encountered La Llorona. Her account was chilling. She described how La Llorona had appeared out of nowhere, with her hair in disarray and her eyes empty and lifeless. The woman had tried to run, but La Llorona had caught up to her, dragging her into the darkness. The more I read, the more I realized that I had been foolish to even attempt to uncover the truth about La Llorona. My curiosity had led me down a path of terror and danger, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a grave mistake. But then I remembered the reason I had started this quest in the first place. I wanted to understand the truth about the legend, to put an end to the fear and superstition that surrounded it, and maybe, just maybe, by understanding La Llorona's tragic story, I could find a way to put her spirit to rest. With renewed determination, I continued my research, hoping to uncover more clues and answers. But as the nights grew darker and the wailing cries of La Llorona grew louder, I couldn't help but wonder if I had already sealed my fate. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront La Llorona and put an end to her haunting once and for all. I went back to the abandoned house, armed with nothing but my courage. As I entered the house, I could hear her crying, but this time I wasn't afraid. I walked towards her, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were still empty, but I could see a hint of sadness in them. I spoke to her, telling her that she needed to let go of her children and move on. At first, she didn't respond, but then she slowly started to fade away. Her crying grew quieter and quieter until it was gone. And then she was gone too. I walked out of the abandoned house, feeling relieved but also shaken. I knew that I had put an end to La Llorona's haunting, but the memories of my encounter with her would always be with me. Over time, the nightmares stopped, and I was able to sleep peacefully again. But I never forgot about La Llorona and the impact she had on me. I began to see her as more than just a ghostly legend. She was a tragic figure, a woman who had been consumed by grief and anger. Now, whenever I hear someone talk about La Llorona, I listen with a mix of fear and empathy. I know that she is out there, still searching for her lost children, and I hope that one day she can find peace